Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Incursions. Today we speak to an American who tracks Chinese military incursions around Taiwan as Beijing sharply escalates its pressure campaign on the country, and as the new chief of NORAD, US North American Aerospace Defense, warns that Chinese military aircraft could begin operating near the US's ADIZ, or Air Defense Identification Zone. We ask what signals Beijing is sending. With us to discuss this are Ben Lewis, PLA Tracker co-founder and defense analyst focusing on China and Taiwan security issues; Tzu-li, Institute of National Defense and Strategic Research, Defense Strategy and Resources Division, Associate Research Fellow; and Guermantes Lailari, Institute of National Defense and Strategic Research, Visiting Researcher, and he's also a retired US Air Force Foreign Area Officer specializing in irregular warfare and missile defense. A very warm welcome to you all on the show today. Ben, let's start with you. So how long have you been tracking PLA activity?
I've been tracking PLA activity since September of 2021.
And how did you get into this?
Well, I was studying Taiwan's defense in my undergrad, and I discovered the Ministry of National Defense's daily reports on PLA activity. And I noticed that the trends that we were seeing in Chinese activity were a great indicator of the PLA's capabilities and their signaling about key developments in the Indo-Pacific region.
Tell me what was happening round about that time when you got into it. What in geopolitical events?
It was interesting. The activity levels were much lower than they are now. Right when I started was the Golden Week exercises, where the PLA sent the highest number of aircraft towards Taiwan tracked in a single day on record.
Which was how many?
56 on October 4th. It was very interesting to see how the composition of these flights changed over time, what the PLA was prioritizing in regards to where they were flying and what kinds of aircraft they were sending. So the trends have been very interesting to follow.
We've got here one of your latest PLA Tracker dispatches. It covers the beginning of April. If you could take us through what it all means and, assess it for us.
Sure. So PLA Tracker covers a wide array of key trends in the Indo-Pacific. The four covered here are PLA activity in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, around Japan, and Chinese orbital launches, so satellites and orbital payloads. What we saw in the first week of April was a significant number of PLA aircraft tracked around Taiwan. But what we saw actually was that after the earthquake, China reduced its activity, I think due to criticism for its military presence following a natural disaster. But in the South China Sea, the activity has remained consistently high, going from the end of March into April, including Chinese joint air and naval exercises corresponding with US, Philippine, Australia, and Japanese joint exercises on the same day. Additionally, there's been a little bit of PLA activity around Japan. It's important to note that Japan is inconsistent in reporting its tracking of Chinese military activity, but what we've seen is fairly consistent levels of activity going into 2024. And currently there are a number of Chinese maritime militia vessels located at various islands in the South China Sea, disputed territory that China is hoping to use these vessels to claim as its own.
Professor Wu, interesting that Ben talked about the earthquake that hit Taiwan, but also there was another pretty significant cross-strait event, which was former President Ma Ying-jeou going to China. Would you expect that Chinese military incursions and activity should, given that was a peace journey by Ma, should that have affected the incursions that Ben was tracking?
Well, actually, from the tracking data this month, we can see actually the profile is getting lower, especially during the Mars visiting China. So I think it's try to create some kind of very calm and warm atmosphere for the meeting. So during this time, the incursion is getting lower. Even some days, few days, and there's no flights at all. Yes.
You would agree with Professor Wu that actually it's tapered off?
I would. I think that going into the election specifically, China reduced its military activity significantly. They broke a lot of established trends and behavior. What was notable was that the day when Ma met Xi, we had the highest number of incursions into the ADIZ since the peace trip began. So
Right.
it can be very unpredictable, but I agree that generally things have stabilized significantly in the beginning part of 2024.
That is interesting. Let's ask Professor Wu, why might that be?
Well, actually, right now, before the inauguration of the Taiwan's new president Lai elected, I think this time is kind of a watching period. Also, because of the Mars visit, it creates some kind of atmosphere, since there's a peace possibility between cross strait. So I think during this time, the China government also try to gain some kind of Taiwanese people's mind, try to show that the China actually is not so hostile to our people. This kind of strategy also is tactics try to gain the people's mind in Taiwan. So we need to look at it very carefully, since sometimes it's just playing some kind of strategy, not just the real things, so how they feel. So it's important.
Maybe to create big, sort of a big splash or fanfare,
Yes,
that
right.
sort of thing as well.
Right.
Guermantes?
So what we've been talking about is the data about what the PLA is doing around the island. And in some respects, by reporting it, we're feeding into their propaganda, because what they're doing is they're messaging whether they like something or they don't like something. And so by Taiwan or Japan announcing it, it feeds into what their messages are.
Giving them a platform for...
Giving them a free platform to say, China's angry, China's happy, you know, so that is something that we should be cautious about.
Sure, but there's arguments on the other side too.
Right.
Which,
But the other side is that it also informs Taiwan what's going on, and the rest of the world about what's happening. So I think that there has to be a sort of a balance,
which is hard, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Ben, would you like to run us through, so what we're essentially talking about is grey zone warfare, isn't it? Between peace and war, this sort of grey area. Give us the reasons why China does this. There's a whole list, isn't it? Several reasons.
Yeah, it varies on a case-by-case depending on what country is being targeted, but generally China has immense power, economic, military, paramilitary, and it uses this power in ways that are, in many cases, deniable and always fall below the threshold of conflict to move the goalpost towards, or move its position towards where it wants to be. So, for example, in the South China Sea, using the maritime militia to occupy disputed maritime features is a very effective tool of claiming sovereignty over those things. The same can be said for...
creating that new normal, just saying, well...
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. The same could be said with Taiwan. After the Pelosi visit in August 2022, the PLA functionally erased the median line as a boundary in the Taiwan Strait. They had never acknowledged it before, Beijing, but they had respected it tacitly. And when they had crossed it prior to August of 2022, it was a major provocation. Now they cross the median line on a near daily basis. So they've altered the normal. They've created this new normal that benefits their position. And that's the general goal of gray zone warfare, using whatever tools you have at your disposal to move your country's strategic position to a better place.
Professor Wu, let's talk about the senkakus. So I think the data that Ben's tracking would show that there's lots of activity around the senkakus, or in Taiwan, in China, known as a Diaoyutai. Why are they claimed by China, Japan, and Taiwan?
Well, actually, there's some kind of long history. Since 14th century, the China claimed that they are the first one to discover those islands. And since 1895 until the end of World War II, actually it's controlled, occupied by Japan. And after the World War II, the administration from the civil administration from the U.S. take control of those islands until the 1972. Then Japan began the control under the Okinawa Reversion Agreement between the United States and Japan. So since then, the Japan actually take a real control of those islands. But in Taiwan, actually, we know that Taiwan historically is following the China's history claim. Also, that area is a very, very good fishery resources for our fishermen. So that's why we also claim that's our should be our territory. Recently, probably late 90s, also they found this undersea resources, maybe oil things, so make it more important to everyone surrounding.
Okay. Ben, let's take a look now at the sort of full PLA Tracker.
So we're actually a relatively young organization. PLA Tracker was founded only in February of 2024, but I've been collecting data independently since late 2000. Well, I took it over in 2022, and a predecessor of mine built the original PLA Tracker starting in mid-2021.
Okay. What are some of the key trends that you've noticed?
So going into from the end of 2020, when the MND first started releasing data on PLA activity up and until really the election period in Taiwan in late 2023, what we saw was obviously increasing numbers of PLA aircraft flying in more diverse areas. So not just in the southwest, but over the median line in the northeast, in the east, and in the south of the ADIZ. Additionally, what we saw was increasing diversity and complexity of the flights. So essentially, what kinds of aircraft were flying. It used to be primarily anti-submarine warfare with the occasional fighter jets making an appearance. But moving forward, what we saw was almost the entire Chinese aviation forces represented in the ADIZ at least once, and often flying in complex groups together, practicing command and control, practicing joint strike. And in addition, the kinds of flights that were taking place, instead of just navigation, they began conducting aerial refuel or joint air and naval patrols. So it was a trend of increasing activity in quantity and in quality.
G-Man, what does all that mean?
What it means is that, first of all, if you want to make the comparison of what they call the anaconda strategy of the snake slowly choking off Taiwan, that is what Ben is explaining. And the gray zone is a mechanism for them to achieve that without causing war. In other words, decreasing the space that the ROC military can react to any kind of provocation.
So it's like a strangling. You talked about the different areas, and gradually it's getting smaller and smaller and tighter and tighter.
Right. And so what the incursions are doing is, first, as Ben mentioned, before August of 2022, it was rare that the PLA crossed the midline. But after that, they were crossing it a lot of times. The other significant thing is going around the island. So first you had the UAVs going around the island, then you had fighters going around the island, then you had bombers going around the island, then you had
so this is an escalation.
Escalation. And now, from the tactical point of view, maybe some days it'll be nothing, maybe something, but overall, it's becoming more and more activity closer and closer to Taiwan. That's the anaconda strategy.
And Professor Wu, so Ben spoke about the joint patrols, about the sort of the greater diversity of different kinds of aircraft, but I also understand that it's naval vessels too, of course. What do you think the PLA is doing? Are they practicing?
Yes, actually, when I look at those incursion data, probably we can sorting out some kind of pattern they are doing. For those fighter jets along the median line, most of them will be fighter jets. They are doing normally we call so-called combat air patrol. They try to normalize their activities, which Ben just mentioned before. The other one is doing some more complex exercise in the southwest as well as in the east part of Taiwan. And the aircraft types is very diverse. Most of them include early warning aircraft, also about the tanker, and even the bomber. So they are actually doing some kind of a scenario type of exercise. They try to exercise, mostly to my mind, is try to practice their denial capability, which targets the U.S. forces around the area, which we already know they try to push the U.S. force back to the second island chain even further. So I think they're just not playing around, actually exercise, try to level up their readiness in order to meet future challenges from the U.S.
Okay. Ben, we have spoken about kind of like the military craft, aircraft as well as naval vessels, but actually they've been using a variety of non-military craft too. Can you tell us about, the high altitude balloons? There's also been more sort of survey vessels, ships that we're seeing coming really quite close to Taiwan.
Yeah, starting in December of 2023, the MND began releasing information about balloons that were tracked. At the time, we were told that they were meteorological balloons, weather balloons. And then starting on January 2nd of 2024, they started reporting fairly consistent airspace violations from these balloons, flying between as low as 11,000 feet and upwards of 35,000, 36,000 feet. So I think that was a case where because China had reduced its military presence around Taiwan going into the election, it was a very effective tool to put pressure on Taiwan not using military forces. I think also the weather played a role. The winds were right to use balloons that way. So that's been very notable, but also we've seen a reduction in that in recent weeks. Going into April, I think we've had one balloon this month so far. This time last month, we had already had almost 10. So that's definitely notable.
Guermantes, do you have any assessment of why that might have happened, that it's now dropped off?
Well, so first of all, the weather balloons are launched by the PLA. They're not being launched by the weather agency of China. Second, the psychological effect of having Chinese balloons flying over Taiwan is disturbing. It's almost like what happened to the United States a year ago, where there was a massive Chinese balloon flying over the United States with a lot of reconnaissance, intelligence, ISR type equipment. And what the MND did not report is what exactly is the payload on those weather balloons. Now, they appear to be benign weather related, but it doesn't mean they couldn't have had other cameras or other kinds of systems on them. For example, maybe collecting on phone calls that were going on in Taiwan. So the idea that China can overfly Taiwan without any consequence is disturbing. It goes along with the anaconda concept of not only are they getting closer to Taiwan, they're flying over Taiwan. And there was one report where there was a UAV, unsure whether or not it flew over, but if it possibly did fly over Taiwan, that would be another disturbing trend. Even though it's not manned, the UAV, if it flew over, is another escalatory act of creating the idea that Taiwan is vulnerable to the PLA.
Which is ties in with what you were saying about how, in a sense, we're playing to what the Chinese want, which is, essentially intimidation of the Taiwanese. And
to show vulnerability, that they can't do anything about it. They're unable to deal with this problem.
Professor Wu, there's been a recent report, the new commander of NORAD, who's also the head of US Northern Command, General Gregory Guillet, has warned that Chinese military aircraft could begin operating near the US's ADIZ, I assume that's Alaska, as early as this year. What do you think is the significance of this development?
Well, actually, I think this comes recently news. The deputy commander of the PLA Air Force, Wang Wei, recently just announced that the steel bomber H-20 are going to reveal very quick, very fast. For those bombers, there's a capability to fly like a B-52. It came from over the intercontinental. Of course, it got a capability to touch the ADIZ of the U.S. On the other side is the Yun, the tanker Yun-20, which also provide the system capability for those fighter jets, as well as the bomber jet at H-6K, extend their flight range, so they can close enough to launch attack to the American territorial. So I think there's two major points. Probably the USA observed that recently probably it's going to happen this year. So that's a raise the alarm.
Right. Jiman, if you can briefly address essentially what Professor Wu has said, it's an expansion of the PLA's reach. And also, you know, what I understand is that it's usually Russia that is the one that is making these incursions. Right. So what does that mean? Are they working together?
Yes. Last year, there was a case where the Russians and the Chinese had naval ships that came close to Alaska for the first time in a long time. And you also see the same kind of behavior of this going around the country of Japan. Russian and Chinese fighters and ships go around Japan. The communist China doesn't have to do that around Taiwan. They can do it themselves. But they're working with the Russians to go around Japan, and they work together doing some actions against the United States. And I think this messaging that the general is saying is to prepare the population for this kind of aggression. It's sort of, it's similar to what China's doing to Taiwan. It's pushing. And the idea behind the gray zone is if you don't push back, they're going to keep on pushing, as we see in Taiwan, as we see in Japan. And so now it'll be up to the United States to decide how they're going to respond to these kinds of acts, which they've been dealing with the Russians since the beginning of the Cold War.
Okay, Ben, let's get to some of the changes that the Ministry of National Defense, Taiwan's Defense Ministry, has made in its reporting, which I understand that you disagree with.
I do. Early in January 15th, the MND changed the structure of its reporting. It had a reduction in specific information about aircraft types and quantities. And it also changed the formatting of the map. In some ways I agree with, in other ways I don't. My view, and the view of some colleagues I've written research on this with, is that Taiwan should be sharing more information, emulating the Philippines in using, shining the light on China's gray zone tactics to build international support and regional resolve against China's intimidation tactics.
And it's also sort of helping to shape a narrative, isn't it? What is that narrative? Why we're advocating for it is that Taiwan can also shape a narrative.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. Taiwan can say, and they've said previously during major exercises, we have the capacity to monitor this. So in August of 2022, the example I like to point to is that the PLA claimed that Chinese Navy ships entered Taiwan's territorial waters, and the evidence was a photoshopped picture of a Chinese Navy vessel. And Taiwan called them out and said, no, this is in fact false. You attempted and we blocked you from reaching the territorial waters. I think that's a great example of Taiwan shaping the narrative and saying, we have, China's much bigger than us, they have a lot of capabilities, but we have the ability to defend ourselves. And I think that by sharing more information and saying, as much as China does, we're watching carefully, is a very effective tool for Taiwan.
Professor Wu, it also, there's also another narrative, isn't it, which is about the aggression of China.
Yes. From this point of view, that I also to respond to Ben's idea, to my point that we, as a MMD, they need to do some kind of strategic communication to the public. And how to do it? I think that they are adjusting their way to do that. You can obviously the change of the way to declare the data information.
Which is if we can actually specify what that was, Ben. So the key changes were no more identification of
specific aircraft.
Okay.
So, and the quantities of the specific aircraft, so the types and categories.
And where they flew.
And where they flew specifically, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I think to the public, general public with no military professional experience, what they're concerned about is whether there is any kind of activities out there. They are not concerned actually how many numbers, what kind of flight over there, to my point of view. But since we have imminent threat from China, so we need to preserve our capability. And we need also to worry about, once we review all those data, it can be catched by the cross-strait military professional, how they can use that to analyze our capabilities. So I think we also need to think about that, especially from the military leadership. So I think that's the reason they change that into a very broad, integrated way to review the information.
Jimo, on the very final question, we have to end the show. So given what Professor Wu has said in terms of the, some of the restraints, there's the security considerations, how do you think the M&D could make changes or make improvements to satisfy the demands of people like Ben and the wider security community in needing to know about these incursions?
Well, I think that, first of all, the change they made denies the public the information that they seek, but the operations security part is a problem. So the bottom line is, perhaps during high levels of activity, the M&D should maybe release more information to give the public what is the threat. But on a day-to-day basis, they don't need to, because if it's normal or slightly increased, there's no need because the public doesn't really care. But when it cares is the time when there is a threat. And I think that that's when is important. And all the examples that Ben gave are all times of high levels of activity. So I think that's the time that the M&D should open up the information so that people understand what's going on.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Ben Lewis, Tzu-li and Guermantes Lailari for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you next time.